Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Centre Stage and our year's first Water and Business panel. Today we are talking about corporate water stewardship in the shifting global landscape. To discuss this issue, we have with us on stage Johanna Barata Carrera, Global Head of Strategic Sustainability Topics with Inter IKEA. We have Joe Reid, Head of Water with CDP. Louise Ellis, Associate Director, Arup. And we have Pim van der Maal, Thematic Water Expert with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Government of the Netherlands. Now, Pim, I actually want to come to you because the Water and Business series is made possible with your support. What we are seeing, however, is that priorities are shifting. You have a new global strategy that prioritizes water alongside food and health. But if we look at the global ecosystem, we have reducing aid and rising instability. What will this mean for your role as a donor in forums like this?
Thank you very much for that question. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a good question. I don't expect you to follow Dutch politics, but it's kind of a fluid situation right now with elections coming up in October. So talking about strategy policy is a bit risky in a way. But we work with the strategy which was released in February. And you're right, health, food security, water are key themes there. When it comes to the geopolitical realities, they're more reflected in the other three dimensions of our strategy, which is about trade, migration, and security. So the 6 dimensions form basically our strategy, interrelated topics as such. At the same time, what it means is, of course, also that we work in a different way, the how we do things, particularly in terms of what you were saying about the reductions in ODA flows. The how is very much and growingly about strategic partnerships and alliances, and looking for leverage points of our work, not just our money, but also our work with other partners, so we can collectively generate more knowledge, more financial resources for achieving the SDGs as such. And in sync with that, of course, we look very carefully at the instruments which we have at our disposal to match those ambitions, particularly providing space and opportunity also for private sector to come in.
Thank you, and I think that's critical because you talk about strategic partnerships and leveraging opportunity. Joe, you were with us on stage last year, and at that time we were talking about policy and the role policy could play in terms of driving business. A lot has changed. You moderated a roundtable yesterday where you brought multi-stakeholders together to try and see the way forward. Tell us a little bit about that roundtable, what came out of it, what were the discussions?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, it's lovely to be back here at World Water Week, and thanks to the Government of the Netherlands and, of course, to CWE for re-establishing this programme, the Water and Business Programme. It's always a highlight of the week. It's been a very volatile 12 months since we were last here on stage, and Pim has already alluded to some of that. So we spent the roundtable yesterday trying to really unpack some of these major trends that we've been seeing globally since we were last here. I think there are 3 that are worth just highlighting. The first is this erosion of the international aid architecture and multilateralism more broadly in some contexts. And I think that's part of a longer-term trend that we're living through, which is a transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world, with more great power rivalry, more geopolitical friction as a result. And that's been accompanied by shifting priorities in the global north, in particular around reallocating budgets towards defence, and often that's coming at the expense of aid budgets. And so that's a real challenge for all of us working in the development and the sustainability space, but it's also something we have to be clear-eyed about and really come to terms with. In relation to that, and one of the second headwinds that we talked about yesterday in the roundtable is the market pushback that we've seen around ESG. It's become a very contested concept now, and that's particularly noticeable in the capital markets, where we've actually seen net outflows from ESG-labelled funds for the first time since those funds were established in Q1 2025. And then finally, and again still part of the same big picture here, is the regulatory uncertainty around disclosure and due diligence. That's something we dived into yesterday. And of course, we were here 12 months ago on stage talking about the CSRD, the CSDDD, and how they were changing the game for corporate disclosure and due diligence. I think that's still the case, but we have to recognise that now some of that EU Green Deal legislation, which was so sort of at the forefront, cutting edge last year, has actually been reopened, and the future of that legislation is quite uncertain. So we're living through this incredibly volatile transitional period, and the message that came out from the roundtable is that, yes, the world is changing fast around us. That's something we have to adapt to, but it's also something that we can be proactive about shaping. And there are opportunities. Sometimes it's quite a bleak picture, but there are opportunities amongst that, and I'm sure we'll get into that into the conversation today.
Thanks, Joe. So basically, we're looking now, and Louise, I want to ask you, with the uncertainty that Joe's put on the table, what we've seen in the last 12 months, of course, we've all experienced it in our own agendas, in our own ways, in terms of how there have been changes, there have been rollbacks, there have been pivots that have to be made. For Arup, what has that meant for you? And what actions have you taken in terms of what's happened in the recent past?
Yeah, great question, and it's wonderful to be here today. I think when there's those headwinds, you have to be really clear about your purpose. And for Arup, the purpose is to shape a better world. We're very fortunate that we're employee-owned, and so that's that element of self-determination. And I think that rolls through into the way that we operate as an organisation and a business. We're driving sustainability in two ways. The first is through our operations, but as a built environment consultancy, we can have our biggest impact through the way that we help our clients. So in terms of our operations, we're committed to decarbonise net zero by 2040, but also to protect and restore nature. And that, I think, is really crucial. That's through land, water, oceans, air, biodiversity. For water, our Arup offices, our new ones, are particularly, we're taking a circular economy approach there. We're really looking at things like our new London office, for example, uses rainwater harvesting, both to kind of flush toilets, but also for irrigation. We're also investing in water stewardship projects. We've particularly invested in the restoration of some degraded land in Lincolnshire in the UK. And as part of that, there's work to kind of restore water courses through that project. But as I mentioned at the start, I think we have our biggest impact through the work that we do with our clients. And we've really been investing in kind of tools that can help our clients. The first is the Water Resilience Assessment Platform for businesses. It's a new framework that helps businesses to assess and improve their water resilience, not just for their operations, but also beyond the boundary. So it enables them really to work in a participatory manner with communities outside their operations, but crucially to look for opportunities for water stewardship in the catchment or basin where they're operating. The second is that we've developed a toolkit particularly for water resilience for data centres. This is probably one of our biggest growth areas, both in terms of the work we're seeing, but also in terms of water stewardship. Data centres need water for cooling, but we've been working with those data centre providers to kind of drive down that water use and that water demand, such as kind of reusing cooling bleed off inside the data centre itself. But also to kind of help them with a playbook of how they look for responsible corporate water stewardship projects locally.
I think the data centers question, of course, something that will come up again and again when we're talking about water stewardship particularly. But Louise, what you're saying is kind of lead by example and to do it internally and then go beyond the boundaries. Jana, that brings me to you, and we touched upon it this morning in terms of the sheer size and scope and potential, talking about leveraging opportunity of IKEA. You're present in 63 markets, over 480 stores around the world. So how do you look at this past year? What does IKEA do with the changes that have happened, both negative, potentially positive? How do you plan within your internal space?
Thank you for the question. I mean, yes, the last 12 months have been a lot of changes, and we're not always going in the same direction. But I think there's one thing, being a private company, for us, the direction has been clear and it remains clear. And I think we also see in a world when many businesses are retracting or going back from certain sustainability commitments, for us it's even more important to say we're here for the long term and our sustainability goals and ambitions remain. And I think that is one of the main messages. And if you look, yes, the last 12 months have been very volatile, but actually, if you think on the other side, if you are a business that wants to remain resilient, that wants to keep proactively in understanding the environment where we are operating today and how does that environment look like tomorrow, to be able to adapt and adjust and stay here for tomorrow. And if we want to be a leader, actually not much has changed, because the challenges and the opportunities, whether it is around the water or other sustainability topics, they actually remain. So you could be saying that the whole regulation that has been conversation, and Joe, back to what you were saying 12 months ago, we were really happy that all this regulation was coming our way, because that would really, when the tide comes in, it lifts all the boats. But now when the tide is unsure, our boat will continue to be lifted. And I think specifically around corporate water, our ambition that we have identified for our water agenda is and will continue the same. Because we want to, and we have committed ourselves to improve water security in the IKEA value chain, and protecting nature and supporting the communities connected to the basins where we are operating, while inspiring widespread action and by 2030. This is not going to change.
That's inspirational, because Joe, I'm going to ask you, now you work with a number of different corporates. You're also assessing their reactions to what's happened this last 12 months. And you've heard what Johanna said. Is that what your corporate partners are saying? Has there been a pivot? Has there been a change in terms of what their expectations are?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have a wonderful image of IKEA as a hovercraft, as a boat that has been elevated and has stayed elevated, even if others have fallen away. But in all seriousness, I think there's a very, very important point that Louise makes, which is that the environmental facts haven't changed. The narrative has changed. There's been political pushback. This ESG concept has become more contested. But the environmental facts are as material as they ever were. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on. So there was a comment yesterday, actually, in the roundtable that it's not so much that the facts are on our side, but we as a water and sustainability community are on the side of the facts. And that little semantic nuance is something that I think is worth dwelling on. Just to give a little bit of an illustration from CDP's point of view, we've seen examples of financial institutions dropping the ESG label, but doubling down on financial risk and the financial materiality of water, because they understand how fundamental it is to them. And the data bears this out. So water disclosure numbers through CDP are going up, not down, in spite of this very contested landscape that we've talked about. And just to sort of illustrate some of that from a fresh round of data that we have, in 2024, companies reporting through CDP identified a total of $339 billion worth of water-related risks at a total mitigation cost of $58 billion. So in other words, those companies are understanding that water risk is material. They're taking steps to assess that risk, both in their direct operations and in their supply chains. They're reporting on that, so their investors are aware that they're aware of those risks and seeking to manage them. And they understand that it's in their interests to mitigate those risks. And always when we have this conversation about risk with business, we mustn't forget the opportunity side as well. It's not just about managing and mitigating risk, it's also about seizing opportunities. And again, the data bears this out. So companies are self-reporting through CDP in 2024, water-related opportunities totaling $1.4 trillion, according to our data, at a realization cost of $87 billion. Now, these are huge abstract numbers, and we can't do much with them in isolation, but I think they illustrate the fact that Louise mentioned. Companies are aware of this increasing materiality of water, and even in a context where narratives around sustainability are shifting, that's where we need to focus.
So if I ask you a quick follow-up, because of course these are the meta-narratives, and they're positive, because they're showing us that we can get distracted by headlines, but when we come down to action on the ground, people are understanding, not only from a self-sustaining point of view, but actually in a stewardship point of view, things maintain the same. From yesterday's roundtable, what were the causes of optimism that came from the stakeholders that you engaged with? Was it similar to kind of the meta-narratives that CDP has found?
Yeah, it was. I mean, when we discussed the trends that we're all experiencing and that Pim alluded to earlier, it is quite a bleak picture. But once we started talking about resilience, the mood in the room changed, because there's this recognition that actually in resilience there is opportunity, and nature abhors a vacuum, as they say. If there is a political and economic vacuum emerging in the sort of stewardship and development world, because the assumptions that have guided our political and economic systems over the last few decades are under threat, that presents an opportunity for us to shape new narratives and to identify new opportunities. So there were some causes for optimism, and if I can just give you some very concrete examples. There's a lot of talk about defence. NATO have made a spending commitment of 5% of GDP amongst all of the NATO countries to defence every year by 2035. Huge numbers. Let's not forget, 3.5% of that is direct military spending. 1.5% of that is critical infrastructure. There is no more critical infrastructure than water. So that, again, is a very concrete opportunity. And then tariff disruption is leading to supply chains being put in the spotlight on the C-suite agenda for the first time in who knows how many years. So for those of us working in stewardship, are we talking to procurement colleagues? Are we talking to the supply chain teams to identify opportunities to insert water resilience into that conversation? So there are opportunities there. We just have to be thoughtful about how we find those entry points and use the right language to bring the right actors to the table.
But that's a great point to pick up, because in this urgency, in this visibility, we have spaces for negotiation. We have opportunities to actually come together. Pim, you've come back to Europe after many years in Africa, and you talked about these spaces for negotiation that come up when urgency is seen in a different way, when collective communities come together to start looking at water stewardship and the results that come from that.
Yes, for sure. And in Kenya, in many places, the impacts of climate change, the effects it has on water are directly impacting people's lives and impacting business. And there's some great examples where in the Rift Valley, of course, there's lots of horticulture and flower business. Companies there, they see the risks, but also they see the opportunity. And that means they have to deal with, in courses of a couple of years, with too much water, too little water. And some of these companies, they venture to invest in reducing their water footprint by using hydroponics. They work on water quality by using biopesticides. But also, more importantly, I think they proactively engage in some of these fora, which are institutionalized in Kenya for discussing the scarce resource. In Kenya, we talk about the water resource user associations at the ward level. And it's very important that the bigger users engage there and talk with those who also use the water, maybe upstream or downstream, and also faced with the same issues, to come to some kind of consensus on equal distribution or a more fair distribution of the resource. But it has to be said, some of these structures which are put in place to have that conversation with entrepreneurs, with the community, they're not that strong. So collectively, also hopefully with the private sector, helping to strengthen those institutions, that I think is a very important thing to look into. What I also noted in Kenya is that unfortunately the drive to engage on water is very much on the side of water sanitation hygiene, and not so much on the resource and the integrated water resource management. Also something we need to advocate for, that we treat that part of the water cycle equally to the other parts, which might be more sexy to talk about or might have more direct impact in a shorter term. So if we can rally behind boosting the attention to water resource management, that will be great as well. At the same time, the Netherlands is also really looking at mechanisms, supporting mechanisms that broker peace, because water leads to conflict. We can already see that in Kenya along river basins, particularly in the drier parts of Kenya. So we work with the Water Peace and Security Initiative, for example, but also strengthening local traditional ways of mitigating conflict, and try and improve and mitigate conflict from that perspective.
I think that touches upon what Joe was talking about also, to read in between the details to see where the opportunities are to actually set up win-win solutions.
Exactly.
Now you talk about, of course, I would like to bring the hovercraft and the basin together. And Louise, I'm going to come to you because you talked about how the collective becomes important.
Very important.
How working at the ground level and understanding where you stand at and seeing yourself reflected allows for ownership, to connect the local, the basin level to the hovercraft. Louise, what are your clients looking at, again, in the last 12 months? You touched upon data centers, huge new key stakeholder, huge new integrated factor at the basin level. How are you working with them to help them understand what can be done, the opportunities, the spaces for negotiation?
Sure. Similar to what Joe said about what CDP is seeing, we're actually seeing a relatively positive picture on water stewardship. We're seeing an increase in requests for support in this space across various sectors, traditional ones like textiles, but also kind of more newer sectors like data centers. Companies are increasingly recognizing the need to address business resilience, water security, environmental degradation, and work beyond the boundary to do that. We're also seeing the desire to do water stewardship really well and to do it properly. For example, we've been working with Primark, one of the kind of big multinational textile companies, to develop a water stewardship toolkit for their regional sourcing managers and leaders, and do that through primary research with those leaders, but also with their supply chains, to really understand the context-specific human-centered approach that needs to be taken in terms of water stewardship. You mentioned data centers. They are probably our biggest growing client base in terms of water stewardship. Many of them have targets to be water positive by 2030, 2040, and thus are kind of doing quite a lot and putting on a lot of effort in this space. I would say, again, we're seeing a real desire to do it well. We're working on a project at the moment in Denmark where we're working with a data center client who's also going to do a river restoration project right next to their site, which is always wonderful to see it being very local. And as part of that, they're thinking about the recreation and amenity and social value benefits that they can deliver as well to the community. There are some kind of key trends across the sector generally. The first is the desire for more case studies and for more sharing around what good looks like in this space and how they are practically set up and operating. The second is a challenge, maybe more, is that often there's an ask to be able to commit to outcomes at the start of a project, and that can be challenging when you're working in a very specific context, in a kind of very in a very nature-focused way. And the third is we are seeing an increased desire to act locally and align with local needs. And that really highlights the need for local conveners, NGOs, community groups, to kind of support convening and bringing kind of communities, municipalities, and the corporates together to kind of develop and work together to work out what an equitable way to deliver these projects is.
I think what you say is really resonant. I'm going to come to IKEA next, and of course, I will ask them to answer your questions, Louise. No, but you say what good is, and I think that's really critical. And of course, how to stay the course, but also you've got an increasing number of people that are now part of the conversation. How are they represented? And Jan, I'm going to come to you because you said when you started the conversation today that the science hasn't changed. Your principles, and I think Louise also mentioned this, know your purpose, know where you want to be. But on the ground, as we're hearing both from Pim and from Louise, the stakeholder group is changing or enlarging because we want to include everyone to be part of this conversation, to own this conversation. From IKEA's point of view, what does that look like now when you move forward on corporate water stewardship to align, again, let's take the hovercraft example, the hovercraft to the basin?
Yeah, I mean, it really is about what Pim was saying. The what remains, but the how is shifting. And if I look back 24 months ago, we were having conversations with our partners and suppliers and saying, this is what you need to do because legislation is coming. But before that, before legislation started to come, we were saying this is what you need to do because this aligns with our goals and this will be better for your businesses. It was all about the business case. So I think what we have seen in the last 12 months is dropping again the conversation on we need to do this because legislation is coming, and go back to the dialogues that we were having before. We need to do this because this is the only way to be relevant and stay in a future where things are changing and people feel it at local level. I mean, there's the floods and there's the droughts. They're already experiencing it. So it's no longer about bringing with the business cases, tell me what to do, what do I need to measure and how. These are the questions that we are having. And also, as you say, on a local level, to really engage not only the usual suspects, but also the communities. And it's easy to talk about communities, but sometimes it's it's harder to make it really concrete. Who are the community representatives that we can bring in this specific case? Is it for a supplier, workers, unions, worker representatives, the small city where the supplier is? That is sometimes you need to adjust and understand what is the local context to then find who can speak and bring the insights from a community point of view. So both that we identify the right stakeholders, because having wrong stakeholders at the table is also not going to help us, but really about having the why very clear to everybody. Why are we doing this? Why is this? Why does this make sense? Business sense and community sense.
I'm going to take that, Jan, and come to Pim for the last comment on the panel, because Jan, you touched upon what the regulation did. And now moving ahead of the regulation, you find that you're actually going back to the why. The why hasn't changed. And so, Pim, I'm going to come to you and say, we often talk about self-interest like it's a bad word, that we shouldn't touch upon it. But isn't self-interest the most honest motivation for us to go forward? And can't that be inclusive as well in terms of how we can work together? When it comes to the work that you've done, of course, in Africa, and of course the work you're doing now, what do you see in terms of the role business can play and government in terms of multiplying the conversation, in terms of taking the potential forward?
Yeah, I think as illustrated by the example I gave from Kenya, but also by the reports from the Global Commission, it is very much to invest in a continuous dialogue, partnership and alliances. It seems to be a little bit of an open door. But the fact that we sit here, again, you could say, even last year and the year before, to keep that conversation going is so valuable. And only then, we can start to understand each other better, also understand each other's strengths better. So you talked about, how to engage with community. I mean, our partners we work with on the ground, they know how to work with communities. They understand them. They have been there for years and years in their support, or they're part of the community as CSOs. So that keep that conversation going. And I think from our perspective, in that sense, related to that, we are really keen to keep focusing on our role in terms of water diplomacy, trying to support platforms like this, but also other platforms like SWA, to really forward the water action agenda, and at the same time, collectively, hopefully, work on instruments which tick your boxes. There's lots of instruments for financing initiatives, but it's often the connection is just not just nice. And only with continuous dialogue we can come closer to each other, also in that sense, developing the right instruments for furthering this cause.
I'm going to give Louise and Joe the last words. If you were to, in one sentence, say how we should be looking at moving forward. We're bringing together companies, industries, governments, CSOs, NGOs, and we're seeing there's actually a lot of good things out there. In one sentence, Louise and then Joe, what are we doing going forward?
I think getting really strong local partners, I think that's the key to success of these projects. Organisations like Frank Water, who convene around basins in Chennai, who really know the stakeholders on the ground and can help kind of bridge that connection and make it very equitable and fair for everybody involved.
Recognise that we're in a new world, So a change of administration in the White House or anywhere else is not going to change the fundamentals of moving from a unipolar to a multipolar state and all the friction that that is going to entail. So keep that in mind. Acknowledge that some companies and financial institutions are feeling very exposed right now, and the appetite for grand public commitments may not be what it was a few years ago, but that doesn't mean that water is becoming less important. We know it is only growing in importance. So focus on making the business case for investing in water resilience.
Thank you so much. So stay the course when everything is changing. Thank you so much. Please join me in giving them a warm hand of applause.
Done me and you bet I felt it. I tried to be chill, but you're so hot that I melted. I fell right through the cracks. Now I'm trying to get